On December 18th, 1994, Port Elizabeth, South Africa, 27-year-old Alison Botha faced a brutal attack that could have taken her life. Instead, she rewrote the ending, and in doing so, became a global symbol of resilience. This is not a story of victimhood, it's a story of a survivor. Alison Botha was born in Port Elizabeth, South Africa in September 1967. She was a bright young girl, even making head girl of Collegiate Girls High School in 1985. After school, she studied for a year at the former Port Elizabeth Technikon and then began working. At the age of 21, she then began traveling overseas. Eventually, Alison returned back to South Africa, where she began working as an insurance broker. On the night of December 18, 1994, Alison was enjoying a night out with her friends. Upon arriving back home to her apartment, a man forced himself into her car with a knife. He told her to move over or else he'll kill her. Alison did as she was told. The man took control of the car and drove himself and Alison to pick up his accomplice. He told her he didn't want to hurt her and that he just wanted to use her car. Alison's captors then took her to a deserted area outside of town. There, they brutally raped her and were determined to murder her afterwards. They began with strangling her, and although she lost consciousness, her captors were frustrated at Alison's will to live, and their brutality increased. They then began to stab Alison at least 30 times in the abdomen, but they weren't done yet. They then slashed her throat 16 times. Alison could hear the slashing and wet noises again and again and again. Her captors believed she was dead, but Alison still clung to life, so then they just left her there to die. Alison later recounted, quote, "I realized my life was too valuable to let go of, and that gave me the courage to survive." Lying there, alone and mutilated, Alison thought to herself that she needed to leave some kind of clue to who did this to her. She wrote the names she believed were the attackers in the dirt, and beneath that, "I love Mum." It was then she could see headlights and willed herself to get up and head towards the incoming car. As she pulled herself up, though, she realized the full extent of her injuries. Her head started to fall backwards due to the numerous slashes to her throat. Her head was almost decapitated, and her intestines protruded from her stomach. She used one hand to hold her head and the other to hold her stomach while she walked towards the headlights. She collapsed along the white line on the road, hoping someone would see her where she was. In the car was a true hero, a young veterinary student who was on vacation in Port Elizabeth, Tian Elliott. Tian stopped upon seeing Alison in the middle of the road. He recalled, quote, "God put me on that road that night for a reason." Tian ran towards Alison and used his skills to assist her, dealing with the wounds and calling an ambulance. The ambulance took about an hour to reach Alison, and Tian stayed by her side the entire time, giving her reassuring words. Alison was then rushed to hospital, and the doctors were shocked at Alison's injuries and how she was still alive. One doctor said in the 16 years of practicing, he had never seen such severe injuries before. Alison, the truly brave and incredible woman that she is, survived her ordeal and she remembered everything. She recounted everything to the police whilst in hospital. Alison identified her attackers as Dans Kruger and Franz Dutoit. Franz Dutoit was born around 1968 and grew up in Jeffreys Bay, South Africa, and was raised by his mother. He claimed he was the byproduct of rape and that he didn't know the identity of his biological father. His mother had several relationships with men growing up. He abused both his mother and himself. He later stated that he had witnessed his mother being humiliated both sexually and physically, and at times he stepped in to defend her, only to be hurt himself. Dutoit's mother later remarried, and he was legally adopted by his stepfather. His stepfather worked as a police officer and had a daughter of his own. He was a Christian man who tried to instill these values on Dutoit. Dutoit remained close with his stepfather until his death in 2004. Despite this stability in life, Dutoit was already showing signs of depravity. His new half-sister later reported that he had raped her on several occasions growing up. At school, he was violent and argumentative, even being expelled for trying to set fire to the school. He then began hanging around with gangs and getting into drugs. Dutoit later claimed he first raped someone at the age of 15, his victim being a 45-year-old woman. He says that at that point he was already a prolific rapist, and there are many victims out there that the courts did not know about. He briefly joined the army and then filtered from job to job. Eventually, he set up an unlicensed bar and prowled the streets looking for victims. On the 25th of February 1994, a 20-year-old student was in her car when Dutoit forced his way into the car and held the woman at gunpoint. He then drove away and raped her. He then took her to a cafe and got her something to eat. Bizarrely, he stated to his victim that he would kill any man who raped his sister, the same sister who later reported he had raped on numerous occasions. The victim was then taken to another spot where she was raped again by Dutoit. He finally let her go, saying, quote, "You're an amazing person, and I hope I can make it up to you sometime." The month after this incident, the victim went to the police to report her rape. Dutoit was arrested and charged with rape and sentenced but released on bail of 100 rand. This is only one of 3 rapes Dutoit was convicted of, but I have no doubt he's committed more. In 1994, a man walked into Dutoit's bar who would later become his accomplice. Hans Kruger was born around 1975. His father abandoned his mother soon after she became pregnant, and his stepfather was reportedly abusive. Kruger later claimed that he was sexually abused by his stepfather. However, his stepfather denied this. Kruger's family moved constantly due to his stepfather's work in forestry. He displayed behavioral problems at a very young age and was apparently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. In school, Kruger was bullied and given the name Three-Tit due to his third nipple. Kruger later reported his mental health got so bad that he had thoughts of harming himself as a child. He then dropped out of school at the age of 17 to join the army. However, he didn't stay for long. He then got a job as a security guard, but shot himself in the foot somehow. Kruger later found a job as an assistant to a foreman with a salt company, but left after he was ordered to clean up a mess by the colleague who had shot himself in the head. He then floated from job to job and found himself hanging around criminals and descending into drug and alcohol addiction. Kruger was described as having very low self-esteem and someone who turned to others for guidance and support. This was the perfect accomplice for Frans Dutoit, thus beginning their campaign of violence against women and leading to the eventual brutality on Alison Botha. On the 4th of December 1994, their first victim was a woman who was 3 months pregnant at the time. She was out walking in Port Elizabeth where she was approached by Dutoit, who thrust a gun into her stomach. Kruger was a short distance away watching the pair and followed as they walked away. She was then taken to a secluded location and was raped by the two. She pleaded with Dutoit that he was hurting her and her baby, but he just told her to shut up and told Kruger to hold her down. Afterwards, they discussed whether they should kill her or not, but thankfully they let her go. On her way home, she saw a police vehicle and flagged them down to tell them what happened. Both men were arrested and charged with rape. This should have been the end, but the courts released them on their own recognizance, meaning they're released on the legal obligation to later turn up to court. Failure to fulfill this obligation can result in a financial penalty. I believe that this reflects the deeply entrenched social norms surrounding sexual violence against women in South Africa during the 1990s, a time when rape was both widespread and routinely minimized by law enforcement and society at large. Dutoit and Kruger were already known for previous assaults. Their ability to reoffend with such brutality suggests they operated with a disturbing sense of impunity, likely believing that they could continue their reign of terror without consequence. On the 16th of December 1994, their second victim was out at night looking for a parking space outside their friend's apartment. She noticed two men watching her and immediately sensed something was wrong. She parked and Dutoit appeared at her car door, trying to get in, whilst also pulling something out from his shirt. He looked away briefly, and the victim took that opportunity to lock the car doors. Dutoit tried the door, but eventually walked away. The next day, they were out looking for another victim, and that's when they spotted Alison Botha. Dutoit and Kruger were arrested and charged with the rape and attempted murder of Alison Botha and the rape of their first victim, the pregnant woman. They both pleaded guilty to some charges, but not others. They both admitted to attempting to kill Alison and raping her, but denied other elements such as robbing her. So they went to court, making their victims relive the accounts of their ordeal. Before the trial took place, both men claimed that they were Satanists, and the devil made them do it. They were also dubbed the Ripper Rapists by the press. The trial began on June 12, 1995, in the Supreme Court of South Africa, presided over by Justice Chris Jansen. The trial unfolded with harrowing testimony from multiple survivors, including Alison herself. The first witness was the 20-year-old student who Dutoit had raped on his own. Judge Jansen found Dutoit guilty of the 4 charges, 2 counts of rape and 1 each of indecent assault and abduction, and sentencing would occur in conjunction with the other charges. On June 13th, the pregnant woman testified on her horrific ordeal. I would like to say that thankfully, the pregnant woman also gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Then it was Alison's turn. The prosecutor, Grant Buchner, guided her through her attack as well as the damage that had caused her physically and emotionally. A member of the public was quoted saying that it was as if someone who should have been dead was testifying about her murder. Tian, who had since completed a course as a paramedic and had decided to become a doctor of people rather than animals, came next, followed by the doctor who treated Alison's wounds that day, Dr. Angelov. He described Alison's wounds and intricate surgery he had to perform. He admitted that he could not explain the fact that Alison had survived. Quote, "It was simply a miracle." Afterwards, the second victim of both the men testified, the one who narrowly escaped their attempts at kidnapping her. Frans Dutoit took the stand. He described his disappointing past and his involvement in Satanism. As expected, he placed the blame for his actions on the demon Incubus, who he claimed had resided within him. He said it was Incubus who had told him to rape all the women and who had told him to kill Alison. Dutoit also downplayed Kruger's involvement, but then also described how Kruger used the hunting knife he had cut Alison's throat with the next morning to prepare breakfast. The knife still had her blood on the blade and Kruger was, quote, very impressed with it. Dutoit continued to describe the rapes in gruesome details, including the stabbing and cutting as if he were recounting a normal memory. He had no remorse or emotion. It was said, though, that he suddenly remembered to include how he didn't have the words to describe how sorry he was and said, quote, "I don't know how I'll ever be able to forgive myself." Dutoit's wife tearfully told the court that she still loved her husband. She repeated the lies he had told her about every crime, but chose to believe that, quote, he had these things in him which caused him to do it. Kruger chose not to testify. Psychologist Ian Mayer's description of Kruger's past and present was not as encouraging, but he nevertheless ended by stating his belief that Kruger could be rehabilitated. He stated that Kruger, quote, had empathy with his rape victims and remorse for what he had done. Despite all of this, Judge Jansen found Frans Dutoit and Thans Kruger guilty on all charges. These were abduction, indecent assault, and rape in relation to the attack on the pregnant woman, and abduction, indecent assault, rape, attempted murder, and robbery with aggravating circumstances in relation to the attack on Alison. Their claims of Satanism made no impact on the judge. He stated that it would be, quote, a sad day when this religion serves as a mitigating factor. The judge also said it was the court's responsibility to remove these two men from society. Therefore, he sentenced Frans Dutoit to 3 terms of life imprisonment, 1 for the charges related to each attack. Thans Kruger received 25 years for the rape of the pregnant woman and a life sentence for the attack on Alison. He continued to order that copies of the sentences be placed inside each man's prison record, so that the authorities will know that the judge wanted them to remain in prison for, quote, the rest of their natural lives. Despite saying that he was remorseful and had empathy for his victims, upon hearing his fate, Kruger banged on the wall and said, quote, "Well, here we go, fuck you all." Despite the danger that these two men posed, and the words of the judge and their prison record, these two men would eventually be released into the community. It was reported by Alison that Dutoit had access to the internet and was posting on social media. Apparently, he had formed an online relationship with a woman in America, and she had reached out to Alison to share the contents of their messages. He stated he was the leader of a South African prison gang and was ordering women to be raped, and Alison was mentioned frequently by Dutoit. He called her a bitch and other profanities. Alison reported this to the prison in 2014 and asked for it to be made anonymous, but apparently her full complaint was given to Dutoit and his internet access wasn't taken away. Due to a later change in the legislation, all people serving a life imprisonment prior to October 2004 were eligible for parole. The first time the two applied for parole was in 2015 and it was denied, but they could reapply every 2 years. Each time, Alison would write to the parole board and pleaded with them to not let them out into the community and the dangers they pose. In March 2021, a clinical psychologist interviewed and researched Dutoit. The report stated he was still a danger to society, if not more so now, and it was alarming. It was clear that if the two were not caught, they would have continued their terror and gone on a rape and murder spree. Dutoit also disclosed that he has raped more women than the authorities knew about. The report concluded that Dutoit has a high risk of reoffending and he, quote, presented with a lack of empathy and had superficial remorse for the consequences of his criminal actions. Despite all of this, though, in June 2023, the parole board approved for Dutoit and Kruger to be released, and was then endorsed by Justice and Correctional Services Minister Ronald Lamola. And on the 4th of July 2023, both men walked free into the community, having served 28 years in prison. Alison and the other victims were unaware the pair had been released. There was outrage in South Africa when this happened, and it would take until February 2025 and a new minister for their parole to be reversed. This wasn't the end of Alison's story, however. She struggled with a deep depression following her attack, but eventually began traveling the world to tell her story. She became the first South African woman to publicly speak about her experience of rape, and in 1995 was the prestigious Rotarian Paul Harris Award for Courage Beyond the Norm. In the same year, she received Femina magazine's Woman of Courage Award and was announced Port Elizabeth's Citizen of the Year. Alison met her husband, Teenie, through mutual friends. They bonded over mental struggles and they brought out the light in each other once again. In June of 1996, while they were eating in a restaurant, Teenie knelt before her and asked Alison to be his wife. She did not hesitate. And on February 15th, 1997, the two were married during intimate ceremony. It was unclear for many years if Alison would be able to have children, given the extent of the injuries sustained on her female organs. But then, in 2003, 9 years after the attack, Alison gave birth to a son named Daniel. 3 years after that, she had Matthew. Alison Botha is not defined by what was done to her. She's defined by what she did next. In surviving the unimaginable, she became more than a victim. She became a force. A woman who stood up, spoke up, and turned pain into purpose. Her courage doesn't just echo through courtrooms or documentaries. It lives on in every survivor who dares to reclaim their story. That is the story of Alison Botha.